All right, I think this is a good time to dive right in. Welcome everybody to this webinar. We're very glad that you're able to join us today. This is Combating COVID-19, the Shenzhen Bus Group's experience. My name is Lina. I'm with the TUMI team at GIZ, and I have the pleasure of moderating this webinar today with you. I think what we just discussed, the number of people who have signed in for this webinar, it's almost close to 400 people. And I think it really underscores the urgency of the issue that we're all facing. COVID-19 has become a health development that's affecting all regions and cities worldwide. It's such a dynamic and fast-paced development that we're witnessing. And I think we're all seeing that it's requiring never-before-seen measures in various aspects of life in order to make sure that everyone is safe. So this is, I think, a great opportunity for us to start the dialogue on, public transport, on the crucial role that public transport operators have to ensure everyone stays safe. At this point, I was hoping or looking forward to introducing our counterpart at the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, who really wanted to address everyone in this webinar. But of course, since the situation is keeping ministries all over the world very busy, unfortunately, on short notice, he wasn't able to speak, but he urged me to address all of you with a short message on his behalf, because the ministry is extremely grateful that everyone is here today joining this conversation. I think it's one of the situations where we really see how urgent the need for international cooperation is to get a hold on this crisis. And the ministry is, of course, especially grateful to the Shenzhen Bus Group for being available on such short notice and are willing to share the experience that they've had and how they've managed to really control the problem of people in public transport, keeping everyone safe, and to answer all of your questions after the presentation to make sure there's as much knowledge and transfer of expertise as possible. So without further ado, before we jump into the presentation, let me just quickly introduce you to the speakers that we have on board today. So we're really happy that Heli Liao is on board. She's the head of international development at Shenzhen Bus Group. She's responsible for international business development, branding, procurement, and advertisement. And I think Heli has a lot of extensive experience working in all parts of the world. She's worked in the US, China, Latin America, and Southeast Asia for organizations such as the United Nations Development Program, McKinsey, and many other international organizations. So I'm sure she's able to relate to a lot of questions from everyone around the globe about how to deal with the situation right now. And joining her is Joe Ma, who's the Deputy General Manager of Shenzhen Bus Group. He's an urban planner with over 30 years of international experience. And just to mention a few other things, he's an eminent fellow of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. He's a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute and a registered professional planner. So he too has extensive experience and is able to help you and give you feedback on all your questions you might have in relation to public transport. Just before we start, some technical information that I think will help us have a smooth experience here. Please do keep your microphones on mute if you're not speaking, so that the speakers aren't disturbed from background noise. You can ask your questions as of now during the presentation. There's a chat function where you're able to choose if they're directed to everyone in this webinar or just to the organizers and speakers. We will compile them and ask them at the end of the presentation. And if we do not manage to answer all the questions here, even though we've really reserved a lot of time for questions to be asked, we will make sure that they are addressed in the follow-up email and that you get answers to the burning questions that you brought to this webinar. There's a short survey at the end of this webinar, which you're also able to say if there's any other information or input you'd like to receive on the issue, and we'd be happy to get your input and make sure that there's more knowledge distributed and shared. So without further ado, I will hand over to Heli, who's going to walk us through the presentation they've prepared for today.
Hi, everyone. My name's Hallie. First of all, I would like to thank GIZ for organizing this very timely and important session. And thank you so much for inviting us here at Shenzhen Bus Group to share some of our experiences and the journey that we went through in the past 7 to 8 weeks, as you know, the coronavirus was first discovered in China in end of January, and where the country was put in virtual lockdown for the past almost 2 months. So yeah, but right now, actually, so today is the second day where there has been no locally transmitted cases that was discovered in China. We had around 39 cases yesterday, which were all imported. It's the second wave of infection that are coming through internationally. So our focus right now at Shenzhen Bus Group is shifted towards managing the cases that are coming in from borders, ports and airports, and etc. So we would delve into a little bit of that later. And obviously, if there is any questions that you guys would like to know from our experiences, from our presentation, please feel free to type, ask, and we would be very happy to answer. And just to do a brief introduction on Shenzhen Bus Group and Shenzhen, for those of you who are not very familiar with us, we are actually the one of three. We're the largest public transportation bus operator in Shenzhen. We have around 30,000 staff, and we run around 6,000 buses in Shenzhen, and around 5,800 taxis. And before, I think we were known as the first company and the first city in the world to run on fully electric buses and electric vehicles. And we have built our relationship with GIZ, mostly previously that we shared a lot on our electrification experiences. But today, I think, without further ado, we're going to dive into some of the measures and implementation on how we managed the spread of the virus 2 months ago. So for the first part, I think my presentation, I'm going to be quite brief here because I wanted to leave out more time for questions. That I think that would be more helpful. So the first part I would introduce is some of the measures that we put in place for our buses and taxis. So back in January, I think due to the effects of the virus and the lockdown, I think that probably most of you who are operating public transportation in your city, that you can see that there's a drastic decrease in the passenger ride. So for us, it was very important not only to guarantee the safety of the public, but also the safety for our employees, because we have around 30,000 employees. So we reduced our services, and we had a mandatory rule for each bus to not carry above 50% load for each of our buses. And we typically use that. We typically use the camera on our buses to monitor the passenger flow. And obviously, that also coincided with our Chinese New Year vacation, which so everything was shut down. People were not going to work. And so we definitely suspended a lot of our services line, especially the intercity routes. So all of that are stopped. And so all our drivers and passengers and staff aboard were required to wear masks, which I understand this might be a different issue in different countries depending on where you are. But back in the time in China, it was required for every person from the general public to wear masks if you go out to either restaurants, especially if you go on public transportation. And the driver and staff on board, they have the right to refuse passengers if you are not wearing masks. And so another key area that we're often asked about is our frequency on the sanitization. So sanitization for our buses is conducted after each service trip across all operating vehicles. And the most important parts are obviously the seats, the armrest, and the handles, which comes into the closest contact with the passengers. And for our offices, bus depots, and other premises, we keep ventilation on 2 to 3 times per day. And each ventilation time is no less than 30 minutes. So just to make sure that, you know, we keep the fresh air running especially for our emergency workers who are still staged at our depot. And so I think one of the most important lesson and one of the most important things that we've learned is to establish an emergency health and safety working group in the beginning of the crisis, and to control and to give out strategies from the top, I think, because this needed to be a very organized effort. Especially for us, we have 5 subsidiary companies, and each subsidiary companies, they would have personnel that are in emergency dispatch, that are in intelligent dispatching center, that they would send representative to be a part of this working group. So these work groups meet once a week. Every week. Once a week.
I just finished with once actually.
So Joe actually just came from one just now. And in these weekly meetings, everyone gives updates on what's happening on the ground. What are some of the new issues that we need to deal with, and we're adjusting these plans accordingly constantly. So I think key monitoring, having a strategy group, these are 2 of the most important things from the beginning, especially for public transportation operators when facing this, you know, very severe pandemic situation that we're looking at now. And additionally, I think one of the very important issue is that on procurement, we did a procurement on a 1 month supply for masks, gloves, and protective gears for our staff, and all of the disinfectants. So including, you know, the soap, the we call it the automatic,
the alcohol,
alcohol wipes for all our staffs, so that we can keep at least some of our lines still in operations even during the lockdown, because there are still need for, you know, logistic vehicles for especially medical professionals to get from their home to office to hospitals, etc. So it's essential that we keep that running. Maybe next slide. I can't control from here.
Who's controlling the slides?
Lena, so maybe next slide, please. Oh, am I?
Okay.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Is it moving correctly for you?
Mm-hmm.
Yep,
That's good. Thank you. And one of the high risk area. So last slide. The last one.
Should be back on the canteen slide.
Okay. So one of the key high risk infection area within the company and within the city is actually our restaurants and canteens. And for us at Shenzhen Bus Group, we have 50 canteens and cafeterias that's servicing 3 meals a day for all our staffs. And it's very crucial that we provide a site that is safe and hygienic. So we've actually, as you can see from the picture here, we've changed all our tables and chairs into one-person tables in the canteen. So, and that we required every staff to come in and to only remove their masks when they are eating. So even when you're, and with minimal contact and interaction and conversations with your coworkers, so that you're basically eating at the table by yourself. And we have time schedules for different departments and different companies, so that to control the flow of people coming in and out of the canteen. So, and all of the tablewares and the chopsticks, forks that we are using thermal sterilizers and wash upon, you know, chlorine content. And so that is one of the key measures that we've taken. And I think so far I think we have been doing quite well. I think we have not discovered any confirmed cases, luckily, within the company, but also within Shenzhen. Just to give you a bit of the background and context, that it's probably the biggest city with immigrant population in China, because it's a very new city. It was built 40 years ago. And we actually have more than 100,000 people that are from Hubei, which was the epicenter of the outbreak in China. So it was very, very important for us to keep track of where our employees, where our staff were at, particularly during Chinese New Year, where everyone travels back to their family and back to their hometown. So we have list of names and your travel destinations that we ask everyone to update every day, so that, you know, from the emergency working group, you would be able to see who has traveled to different cities and different provinces, and particularly our staff that have family and origins in Hubei or Wuhan. If they travel back to Hubei, they were actually asked to stay put in Hubei until further notice. Typically, they stay there for at least a month to two, and whoever travels outside of Shenzhen, come back. Whenever they come back, there is a mandatory quarantine time of 14 days. So that is a self-isolation period that you can spend in your apartment, your home. You can work online, but you are asked to stay put in your house. And the company actually sends a special community service team where we would provide food, provide sanitization equipments that you would need, soaps, etc., that would deliver to our staff's house, just to make sure that, you know, even in self-isolation, that you're not going to be alone. And
Actually, on this point, I like to supplement what Harley just said. Normally, in the canteen, we won't be able to sit as close as each other.
This is the first time.
There is the first time that we've actually sat as close as each other to each other, and I should be wearing a mask, but it does hit that case.
Too, but...
if you see on our tape on our slide here that we have one person sitting on per table, that kind of arrangement. So Harley talked about, you know, the sort of like the staggering of time and sort of like the separation, and this is how we're actually sitting at, you know, when we're having our lunch and having our dinner. So we're typically asked to sit at least a meter apart from each other, and we're not allowed to even sort of like, you know, before we eat and straight after we eat, we have to have our mask on, because in case any of our, you know, like if we have we sneeze or anything, that it gets on the surface of the table or something like that. So we have a very kind of like robust and very kind of a detailed protocol for how we're supposed to sort of like eat in our canteen. Let's go.
So maybe next slide, please. Thank you. Let's see. So for those of you who have maybe visited us in Shenzhen or Shenzhen bus group, that we do have an intelligent operation system and a dispatching center. Maybe a few slides. We can talk about the cruise ship later. We have a dispatching center, which essentially dispatches most of our vehicles in our headquarters in Shenzhen. So during the outbreak, during the most severe time in this outbreak, we had at least the staff that are in charge of dispatching, emergency dispatching, stay on site 24/7. They do it in different shifts, and some of them can access the network remotely at home as well. So we were able to monitor all our cameras on our buses and taxis, and sort of the passenger flow from our headquarters. So I think that made it a lot easier. And one of the other technology that we rolled out was also an app that it's essentially an epidemic prevention app that was linked towards our ticketing system, where so in China, scanning QR code is a very common way for payment, for information access, etc. And we actually recommend all the passengers who come on our buses. This doesn't only apply to our buses, that also applies to our taxis and subway, who are operated by our subway companies here. But it's the same app where you scan the QR code on the bus, and then the passengers are recommended to put in their names, their cell phone number, so just to keep that information in our system and the authority, which is the police system. So in the emergency case of later discovering someone has been confirmed to have COVID-19 on the same bus, then we would be able to send out emergency calls, emergency texts to the passengers who share the same trip, share the same bus. So I think that's one of the very important measure. But I obviously understand, there are different rules regarded to information, GDPR in Europe, etc. So this is not mandatory, but I think in China, for majority of the people's mindset is still that I'm going to leave this information so I would know if anything happens later.
Yeah, I think again this point, Holly raised a point about the sort of like the privacy issue here. We're here in actually everybody's been very cooperative, and they're I think it's a case of telling people that this is to protect them rather than sort of like releasing the information
or gathering your information.
Yeah, gathering information. In fact, what's happening in China, and certainly in the case of Shenzhen, even if I go back to my house, to my home, I have to go through the sort of like the main entrance, and I have to have my ID card to say I actually live in this block of this property here, and then so in case they can trace back where I've been to before, in case I've been to anywhere that's been contaminated, then people can come see me. The residential neighborhood the complexes are very actually controlling people coming into the complexes, just in case they don't want anybody who've had kind of like close contact with a potential contagion to come in the residential neighborhood. And the same with our office. I mean, we're doing the same with our offices. we're not allowing people from the outside to come into our office complex. The office that we're in at the moment, our headquarters, has 25 stories, and they're not all our offices. Some of the floors are rented out, so we have a very stringent control on who can come in. Even the postman, even sort of like the couriers, they're not allowed to come in. They just leave the packages outside. We go and collect them. So
yeah, and to supplement that point, one of the good measure, I think it was universally adopted here in Shenzhen and China, was actually each building and each compound, they only allow one entrance, which also serves as the exit. So anyone, whether you live in this building or if you're just a visitor, you have to go through that centralized entry and exit point. So you would leave your information there. There is usually a guard there that would take your temperature to make sure that you don't have a fever, and then they document your phone number just in case later there is any cases confirmed. So I think that is one of a good way to manage the flow and keep track of who's coming in and out of the building. Yeah, and one of the projects, actually, emergency project that we were put on as a public transport operator was actually an evacuation for passengers on one of the cruise ships months ago. So we evacuated around 5,000 people that from a cruise that came from Vietnam, and so among these 5,000 passengers, 150 of them were from Hubei. So it was crucial that we deliver the kids, and then we had the emergency vehicles parked at the port of Shenzhen and to evacuate these passengers. And yeah, so we sent in 7 emergency vehicles with drivers that were in full protective gears, and all of these drivers were isolated, were quarantined for self-isolated for 14 days after the mission was successfully completed. And among the passengers that had fevered and had mild syndrome or were waiting for test results, we, well, not us, the Shenzhen government put them in centralized quarantine hotels that were designated to host them. So, and later we had dispatched vehicles to send them to the hospitals. So I think as an operator, it's we play quite a essential role in both making sure that all of the passenger needs, public flow are keep tracked, but also in case of emergencies like this, that we were often tasked within a very short time frame and a contingency plan that we have to come up right away. So, but yeah, I think this was a project that we were pretty proud of, and yeah.
And this all happened within, we were given literally about 24-hour notice to do this, it's like, because I'm sure some of you have seen sort of horrendous news about, some of the cruise ships being stuck and with passengers on board and not being allowed to get off, for weeks or 10 days or something like that, even as long as that. So we actually, the Shenzhen government came together very quickly with the hospitals, with the hotels, and with the public transportation. We mobilized, in less than 24 hours. Yeah. Okay. Now you're gonna have me to talk to you about taxis, right? The reason that Harley's passed the ball to me about taxis is for those of you who might know, I'm the chair of the UITP Taxi Committee for the Global Taxi Committee. So I also look after the taxi business here in Shenzhen. As some of you probably, like small spaces, like enclosed spaces, people get a phobia about getting in a taxi, particularly during this period. So in fact, we've actually seen a major drop in our taxi passengers So one way to ensure that our passengers you can still take our taxis is that we've had to very straight away put in some measures to reassure the passengers. Then can we have the slides? Do we have a slide? But the taxis, yeah.
The next few slides, I think there is a taxi slide.
There's a taxi slide. Yeah. Okay.
Could be on the taxi slide already.
Sure. Okay. As you can see here, right, in the taxis, what we've done is, again, Harley talked about the QR code. So we have a QR code. Again, this is not this is something that we don't enforce, and it's absolutely not mandatory. It's voluntary. You can see the QR code here. Passengers can get on, and then they scan the code, and then that will leave the phone number for the taxi driver, and in case anything happens afterwards, we can trace them and call them. And this is not just to protect this is really out to protect the passengers rather than our drivers. As you can see on our screen here, we've also erected these kind of like temporary shields. These are like we did again. We have about, in Shenzhen, we have about there are altogether 22,000 taxis, and within Shenzhen bus we have about 4,007 taxi, 4,781 to be precise. So what we've done, we've erected these shields, right, between the taxi driver and passengers, right. So that acts as like a protective screen for the passengers as well as for the drivers. And so what we call this the minimum context antivirus taxis, and all our drivers are sort of like told to get off the taxi and open doors for the passengers, and then shut the doors. So again, we hear a lot about sort of like, oh, your hands, you have to protect your hands. So passengers don't have to touch the handles, so they can get on the taxis. And we're actually within the taxi, we're providing sort of like the alcohol disinfectant, so the passengers can rub their hands. In fact, one of the things that we're now actually pushing out is apart from that, we're looking at sort of like these temporary kind of paper cover for the seats, so passengers can sort of choose to put a paper between themselves and the seats. And again, we have a lot of drivers because during the spring holiday, a lot of our drivers went back to sort of like places like Wuhan and the Hubei province. And when they came back, we asked them to go on a quarantine for 14 days before they can start work again. So a lot of stringent measures were adopted, including the taxi depots. Some of the properties that we own, we have altogether we have about in the taxi industry we have about 10 depots for our taxis. In the bus business, we have about 100 depots. And Harley just now talked about, within our depots, we have the offices, we have the sort of like we restrict the entrance to one entrance, and everybody coming in will have to do sort of like the temperature test, and leave the name and stuff like that. So very, very stringent measures in terms of the taxi. In fact, one of the new things that because it's actually we're always saying that every cloud is a silver lining, and one of the things that was given us a lot of new ideas is to operate in the future these premium taxis whereby as a result of this, we're going to have our drivers opening doors for the taxi for the passengers, and to give them sort of like as much of a protected, clean environment as possible. And in fact, what I was doing yesterday, we're looking into some products to sort of like what you call those machines that you put in for clean air. What you call it? Not yeah. Will come to me. It's some kind of like a machine that you can sort of clean the air within the taxi compartment. So we're looking at new things like that for our taxi industry. We're also doing the same thing with the buses, and some of the new. There are a lot of new technologies that come out. I'm sure some of you will be interested in finding out, like using UV UV technology to clean to sanitize the bus. We're actually looking at another called a type of nano spray. They can spray all the surfaces in the vehicle compartment, and that will give you that will naturally kill off a lot of germs and bacteria. And apparently that can last for about 5 months. So there's a lot of new products out there, and it'll be worthwhile for you for everybody to look into, not just for this period, but for for future. So because viruses are going to be with us whether we like it or not. They've probably been surviving in this world much longer than us human beings. So we just need to learn to live with them and learn to protect ourselves. Yeah. So in terms of the taxis, we're doing very similar things with what we're doing with buses. But the thing with the taxis, as I said, it's a much smaller compartment, and then passengers are kind of get a phobia because you're in a much more enclosed compartment. Apart from that, we're also facing the issue of some of our taxi drivers not getting enough income from the rides, because we operate on a basis like the taxi drivers will rent our taxis on a monthly basis. So to help them get through this period, this difficult period, we're reducing rental for the taxis. And apart from us reducing rental, the municipal government of Shenzhen is also giving subsidies on a daily basis, on a rental basis. Like each month, they're also helping to subsidize lump sum subsidies to help them reduce their monthly rental, and to also on a daily basis to encourage them to go out and work work, because we still need taxis, right? Because even though that people might not okay, so you understand what I mean. And we're also doing online taxi training for taxi drivers, how to work together. And as a new service that we're providing, we're partnering with a major express Shenzhen, which is like a courier, where during this period we set up a joint venture courier services for them, so using some of our taxis to transport essential particularly medical equipment. There's something that we have also done is we're providing free taxi services for blood donors, because to take them to the hospitals, to the donation centers. So I think that's all I have on the taxi side.
Yeah. So last but not least, just the last points that we would make is that we have really heavily relied on our online platforms, especially our online training courses that we push out, disinfection trainings and all of these classes for our staff, particularly our drivers and our staff at the depot. And lastly, we have counseling services that we offer online for our colleagues that have returned to Hubei, the epicenter, and Wuhan. So we had a team of 32 counselors that provided online sessions during the self-isolation period. So I think that's quite something that we would like to keep the program running even after this period is done. Yeah. So I think that's it from us, a brief introduction. And I think if you have any questions in particular in terms of operations and etc., please feel free to ask, and we'll be happy to answer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hallie and Joe. I think we've actually received quite a lot of questions already. Okay. So it's great that we have some time left in order to address most of them right now. Let me go through the questions. I think some of them were again answered over the course of what you just presented. So a participant asked, how do you prepare your buses, taxis every day during lockdown? Is there any pre-check and clean from potential harm and virus? So I think you went into that, and you showed us how taxis and buses are really being disinfected in order to have a clean start every day, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, for the buses, what we do is we clean them 3 times a day at least. I mean, every time at least 3 times a day. So whenever every time. In fact, during the height of the issue of the contagion, each bus, every time they get back to the other side of the depot, the terminal, they undergo the sanitization process. So things that Harley talked about, we clean the handle, we clean the seat, and we do all the sort of like the services that people can potentially can have their hands on. But at night time, we do a major clean. So for the taxi again, every 3 hours, 4 hours, we clean them. Yeah.
All right. And then someone asked, because you mentioned that you put down the public transport service to 50%, or the capacity in each bus. And someone asked, is there any social distance applied to your passengers? If yes, how do you do it? So maybe the question, did people really adhere to then get on the bus and really stay at least 1 meter away from each other? Or did you have to put some extra communication efforts in to make sure that's the case?
In fact, during the height during the height of the crisis that we had, we were running buses, but the buses, a lot of them were actually empty.
They're empty. Yeah.
Maybe they have 1 or 2 passengers. So the passengers are actually quite smart. They learn to self-isolate themselves. But what we do is we also encourage them to sit, not like you have 2 seats. We ask them not to sit together. At least sit a row, away from each other. So that kind of information we'll provide on the bus. Again, Harley talked about the 50%. We're only carrying the 50% load. And some of you may be interested in, well, what happened? We're still doing the same. We still have the carrying 50% passenger load principle. But what will happen, because with work now, resuming back in a lot of cities, like so nowadays, we all come to work in the morning. We all go home in the evening. We just don't go out at nighttime for kind of entertainment or go out to restaurant. But so what do we do at peak hours is that we, at those locations where we have a lot of passengers waiting at the bus stop, we would have reserved buses there. So in case there is the bus at the front is loaded up to 50%, we would open an empty bus to catch, to take up the passengers. So we call those the reserve buses at busy location, where some of the CBD areas. So that's what we're dealing with it. Yeah.
We also recorded public announcements that gets played on each buses to on wearing masks, social distancing, keeping your distance. But I would agree with Joe that a lot of it is really we're depending on passengers doing it themselves. Yeah. And lucky for us is in Asia, I think particularly after SARS and all the previous incidents, I think the general public has been very, very cooperative. Yeah.
And just to give and you might ask, well, where do we get our reserve buses from in the morning? Because normally during peak hours, our buses are operating at, the peak hour operation is 95%, 96, even up to 99%. But during this period, even now, our bus passengers, the daily passengers, only about 40% normal of the normal passengers of using public transport. So we seen a massive drop in people using public transport. What something that has not been really been negative aspect in this is that people are driving a lot more because they drive their vehicles to work. So we're trying, in order to entice people back to public transport, using public transport, we have to put in some very, very stringent measures to ensure that passengers feel safe about it.
Yeah.
So we have reserved buses in the morning. The reason why we have reserved buses in the morning, because there's a major drop in passenger shares.
So that's an interesting point, I think, because I see some people also asking how much of a shutdown there was. I hear you saying that a lot of people didn't, or they refrained from using public transport. But is there any advice from your side on what level should public transport be limited to? Should it maybe be limited to certain groups of people within a society who are crucial to keep existential parts of social life going on? Or is there something that you can recommend on what level of public transport should be sustained?
Well, we made a very we made an asserted, kind of a concerted effort about not shutting down our public transport, because public transport is absolutely essential to the cities. In the case of Shenzhen, we although we're not as the situation weren't as bad as not as severe as in Wuhan, so we're running most of our services. Most of our particularly the local services. The longer distance services, we don't run them. We maybe reduce frequency, so people are not coming out anyway. But the shorter services, we're running them. We're also running special services for medical personnel. So some of the people working in the hospital, they have to go to and from hospital, and some of the people working in essential industries, like ensuring that there is the daily necessities are being provided to the community. We provide services for with special services for these people, special employment groups. In the case of Wuhan, as I understand, people ask me about this as well. Some of the buses, how do people deal with shopping, like buying food and stuff? So I understand that the Wuhan Public Transport Company, they actually they have volunteers going shopping for some of the residents from the supermarket, and they would carry the food and like to the various neighborhoods. So you don't actually have to go out to the shop to do the shopping yourself. So they organize these volunteers to go and do shopping for you, and they were using public transport to transport all the sort of like the shopping, all the groceries and stuff.
Although there are actually a few cities in China, some big ones, that have completely shut down public transportation during the height of the outbreak. So I think those are decisions that local governments made, and I think it really depends on sort of the logistic vehicles, that availability that you're going to have, and how severe your city is facing right now to make that. But for Shenzhen, we've actually, we have made an effort to not shut down the public transportation, although there are definitely voices that have, think that maybe during that time you should just shut everything down.
Right. And I think there's one question that sort of takes that even a bit further. Someone asked, in many cities, public transport services are run by informal private sector operators without any subsidy from the government. So how can social distancing on public transport be encouraged in these settings? Is there any advice you have?
Well, actually, our taxis are not subsidized. Our taxis are run as on a market basis. So, but government has actually been, the municipal government has been very, very good by giving us subsidies. So, I think it should be a joint effort. It shouldn't, in my opinion, right? My humble opinion, it shouldn't be left just to the private sector. Because it's a concerted effort. Everybody has to. Government needs to sort of like subsidize the industry, because particularly the public transport.
And actually, the work that we have been doing in the past few weeks actually were to figure out some of the subsidizing figures and plans for our taxi drivers, because they're significantly reduced income. And that subsidy that we have to apply through the government. And essentially it's a back and forth negotiation, because I mean, they've got to understand that the drivers are risking their lives, their health by keeping the services.
Just also for you, there's an example that may be worth making reference to, is Hong Kong. I come from Hong Kong, by the way, and Hong Kong government has just issued a major subsidy allowance or whatever to all the sort of like public transport operators. And each vehicle they're subsidizing, there's a lump sum subsidies which they can apply for, including all the public vehicles, taxis and buses and minibuses. So that is something that maybe and Hong Kong is completely run on a market basis. So a lot of it really, I think government also must play a part in helping out the industry.
Maybe that's something that we can very well share in the follow-up email, that we give participants a tip on where to look for what they've instigated in Hong Kong. We'll definitely pick that up. And maybe to the same point, one other question was that when the drivers are in quarantine, are subsidies provided for the compensation they miss out on, or was compensation just paid during the entire time?
Well, for the bus drivers, they're lucky because they still get the salary. They still get a full salary, even though they're quarantined. And in fact, for the drivers who have been asked to go on quarantine, particularly the ones that are coming back from places like severely affected. They are given every day. They're giving food, $200, 200 RMB of allowance. 200 RMB must be about 20 euro. Yeah, so they get the food taken to them, and we have a team of volunteers, and they get put into like if they have their own home, they go home for self isolation. And if they live in like, we also have dormitories, and they can have dormitories self isolation. And some of those who have they either go and stay in a hotel or something like that. Yeah. So we have allowances given to them on a daily basis, and plus they get the salary, as I said. But for taxi drivers, Harley just said, because they rent the taxis, they're like self-employed, right? But we've substantially reduced the rental, and Shenzhen, the municipal government is giving them a daily subsidies if they come out to operate. And then we also, for us, we also quarantine the taxi drivers who are coming back from areas severely affected. And for those, we give them, we're working on a subsidies for them, so like compensation, not subsidies.
Okay, so that's very comprehensive measures that are in place. I think this one question, I think it's great because it highlights from everywhere in this world, people are really listening to you and looking for advice. The question is, for African cities with limited resources and supplies, what are the 3 areas that operators should focus on? So if you don't have, the means to address all of these points that you've just raised and addressed, what are the 3 focal areas to focus on now?
You mean in terms of resources or
resource scarce places?
I mean, in terms of, I guess in terms of, in order to keep this crisis as low as possible, what are the most important measures to, put resources behind and make sure that they're being done?
Well, I think, I mean, as a lot of cities are now realizing that isolation is important. So try not to venture out, really is that is the number one number one kind of rule for avoiding the kind of like the spread of the social distancing. So that's the number one. But then you do need a team of volunteers to provide the daily necessity, the daily necessities. So that would be something that government would need to consider. For public transportation, I think during this period, people in our experience, they're not taking public transportation. They prefer to walk, even I mean, I'm walking work every day. So you should try and avoid going out, avoid taking public transport if necessary. But there are cases when in our situation now, people are starting asked to go back to work now. There's a resumption of work. Then public transport is absolutely essential. And then the thing that you need to do is to make sure that passengers feel safe.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. And one of the questions I think raises an aspect of that as well, because they ask, how do you deal with disabled people, given that they A, are particularly vulnerable to the virus, and B, on the other hand, rely on public transport for their daily errands, doctor's appointments, etc. So how do you deal with this group of people that has to have access to public transport in order to really do the important things in their daily life?
Well, we have special taxis. We have special taxis. Yeah. So during this period, and as I said, even so for the blood donation and for people with special need, we provide services for them. And actually, this is something that the Shenzhen government is providing anyways. But we're just supplementing that kind of services. Yeah.
So it's paid by the municipal government, but we're carrying out the service on behalf of them. And generally, that the PSA is to encourage the people that with disability and with a high risk of infection to stay home and to have team of helpers, community organizers, particularly the community organizers on the ground who live close to their compounds, to organize it and send food deliveries to their door. And typically in China, that people live in communes or compounds where there will be guards and security personnel that could deliver these goods to their doors, and to minimize any interpersonal contacts, because we've definitely seen cases where some of the delivery guys or delivery service providers can get affected, even though that is a very rare case. So they've basically had this no contact policy, which is goods and services that you would leave at one certain location and then, or at the door of the recipient, and then they just get it. Yeah.
I think that there has to be a complete network of kind of a support, not just from the public transport side. Holly just mentioned, even the neighborhoods, there are volunteers going out shopping for the elderly, for the disabled, and even for able-bodied if they are being put in self-isolation. I mean, some of our colleagues, they've come back from abroad, or they've come back from areas which have been high cases, and they self-quarantine themselves, self-isolate themselves, and there are volunteers within the neighborhood to go and do the shopping for them. So what they do is that they will list out, write down a list of what they want from the shop, and then leave them outside the door, and then volunteers will come and pick and then go and do the shopping, and then drop themselves. Yeah. So it's
that's great community effort.
Yeah, it really does require effort and from everybody. Yeah.
It really does. I think we're receiving so many questions, and I promise that we will follow up on all of them. But in the interest of time, there's one question which I think is a very good one to maybe have the last one in this webinar. Someone asked, what was the biggest mistake you made in the heat of the crisis? So looking back, is there one thing where you said, okay, this we would have done differently?
Well, we didn't react quick enough.
Yeah.
We didn't react quick enough, but well, it's never too late, but we should have reacted quicker.
I think given the information that we had, it was the best that we could have done, but still I think we would have wished that we gather emergency information even quicker, that we've sent out information to all our drivers, all the passengers with updated ones, to soothe the panic even quicker, even though I think with these that we've put most of the measures in place within the first week. But still, I think it could have been faster.
Well, having said that, we've not had any. We've only got 2 cases of people being infected, and there are cases where people coming, they've gone home for the holiday and come back, and we didn't react quick enough. So but that's unavoidable. You're gonna have people traveling during the spring break, the spring holidays, and then they come back, they go to different places. Nowadays, this virus is very contagious, and we can really catch it very quickly.
No, and I think that's a very important message in terms of, I think a lot of our listeners and everyone feels that we might have been too slow in the beginning, but I like that you're pointing out that that's not an excuse to, not put the full force of resources and attention that you have behind it now, because we're still able to act on this. And I think that's something very valuable for everyone to take from this webinar, in addition to really also you again reiterating the fact that this is really all up to all of us. So it's very important for everyone to just stay home if they can, and oblige to, what are the security measures, what are the hygiene measures to be taken right now, and then use the resources they have to make public transport safe in the many ways that you just described. So I think with this, let me just thank you again for your time and your effort put into this and all your answers to the questions. Hallie and Joe, we will be contacting you about all the open questions, because there really are a lot. And let me just thank everyone for joining the webinar, for participating in the discussion, and we look forward to continuing it. So please feel free to use the survey after this webinar to let us know what other issues are you interested in, and then together with Shenzhen Bus Group, I'm sure we're happy to follow up on any questions you have. So thanks very much, Hallie and Joe.
Thank you,
everyone.
Good luck, everybody.
Yeah.
Good luck, everybody.
Stay safe, and let's work together.
Okay, thanks.
Right.
Bye.